Today, I am gonna show you 5 helpful tips on how to get the smoothest hyperlapse you can out of your Mavic drone. Tip number 1 is not let the app process it for you, and definitely do not use those automatic settings. Do not use automatic ISO, do not use automatic aperture, shutter speed, white balance, or anything, because what it's gonna do is it's gonna create a stutter. Anytime any of those settings change in camera during your hyperlapse, that hyperlapse is already toast. With the exception of white balance, I'll cover that thoroughly in another video, but just trust me when I say do not use automatic settings at all. Lock them in at the beginning of your hyperlapse, set that hyperlapse to go, do its thing, and don't change anything until it's done. Tip number 2 is a really big one, and that is to keep a raw copy of all your files. Every single picture that your device takes, you want it to save a copy, preferably a raw copy. I will show you real quick with the Mavic 2 and the Mavic 3 Syn how to change that in camera. But if you are using any other device, I highly recommend Googling right now how to change the hyperlapse that it will keep a raw copy or a JPEG copy of those photos so that you can go back and create your own hyperlapse. If your camera's already doing that, make sure you know where to locate those files. Okay, so tip number 3 is in regards to settings. Your aperture setting on the Mavic 3 or the Mavic 2 is gonna be right around f4. Your aperture is gonna be set at 4. That's gonna provide the sharpest image for you. It also lets in a great deal of light. All right, tip number 4 has to do with your shutter speed. This is really, really important. This is a setting you probably just want to lock in at the very beginning and not change at all. I rarely, if ever, change the shutter speed when I'm doing hyperlapse. I'm trying to think of a situation where I have. What you're trying to do is keep the areas that are stationary. If you go much slower than a quarter second, you're gonna start to blur everything out and create a softer image, which is gonna negate the fact of even using the f4 in the first place. Don't go any slower than a quarter second. Get as close to that as you can. Tip 5 is definitely gonna have the greatest impact and give you the most creative flexibility in all of this, and that is to process your photos first in an app like Lightroom through Adobe, and then finalize everything when you render the video in Premiere Pro. There are some free alternatives out there. I have seen some free options out there for processing raw photos. You're gonna wanna process all your photos in Lightroom consistently. And when I mean consistently, I mean identical across the board. So you're gonna take one of your photos, you're gonna edit that photo entirely, copy the settings from that photo, transfer it to every single photo thereafter. If your lighting conditions are changing throughout the capturing of the hyperlapse, you want to just double check all your photos real quick to make sure that you can still make out all the detail that you want to, and also make sure that nothing gets blown out. It is appropriate to adjust some settings along the way, but just keep in mind whatever you do to one photo, you must do to every other photo, or it's gonna ruin your hyperlapse. Next, you're gonna wanna take that into a program like Adobe Premiere Pro, and when you process and render the video, you're gonna wanna use the warp stabilizer to help stabilize that content to eliminate those jitters that were introduced by the camera along the way. And this is not the type of jitters that you create yourself from not paying attention to the first 4 tips I gave you. This is just something that's gonna come along with the process. You can eliminate that by running a warp stabilizer and finding a good balance of the stabilizer, because if you do too much of it, it's gonna cause a it's just like a wavy effect to your footage that is extremely distracting. It makes me motion sick every single time I see it. So you want to find that balance of eliminating the unnecessary movement from your content while not pushing it too far to the point where you get these wavy patterns to your footage. For video software, I do use Premiere Pro, but I've heard some great things about DaVinci. I'm not sure if DaVinci lets you stabilize in the free version of their software, but it's definitely worth checking out if you haven't checked it out already. I do have a sixth, final, and bonus tip for you, and this should help fill in some of the gaps because rarely are these settings going to be ideal. So how do you deal with that? You're going to want to use things like filters. If you can add an ND filter to get the exposure right, it's going to make all the difference in the world. And then if you're shooting in darker settings, obviously you're not going to be using filters. You might want to lock in a higher ISO, and figuring out how high your ISO can go in advance without introducing grain is extremely valuable. And you could sacrifice a little bit of sharpness if you need to with the aperture, if you need to fluctuate your settings a bit. I've gone as wide open as f2.8 or as low as f2.8 when I'm shooting night hyperlapse, because you need every bit of light you can at that point. When you're shooting something that dark, the sharpness isn't as imperative as it is when you're shooting in broad daylight. But you do want to still keep those settings in mind and work your hardest to keep those settings locked in. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. You may still have some questions, no problem. Just let me know in the comments below. I'll be sure to cover those topics later in the 3-part series I plan on doing, and I will answer as many of your comments as I can when they come through. So please do not hesitate to let me know down below what it is that you're hung up on the most when it comes to hyperlapse. I would love to see your content too, so please tag me if you create a reel or anything like that at JustinPB Photography with Instagram. I'm gonna wrap up this video. I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks again for watching.